Hello and welcome to this presentation on diversity in marine science. My name is Scott Xavi, I'm a marine scientist and I'm the founder and director of the Plover Rovers. So to start things off, I just want to say a couple of words about general rules of engagement when we're talking about diversity. That's just something to keep in mind if you're doing presentations on diversity, if you're talking about diversity with your workforce or your volunteers or within the classroom. Just a couple of baseline rules. Obviously, we're going to be confidential. Everything that's being said within the classroom or the virtual space is going to remain there. So I would advise generally against recording. This is just a dry recording, so I'm not actually presenting to a group of people. I'm just presenting to myself right now, just in case you want to run a webinar on diversity and you plan on people engaging with people and them sharing their personal stories. Definitely have a think about if you want to just not record it so that it's a confidential space. It's non-judgmental. Everyone is invited to give their own take on things. We treat everyone with respect. We listen to what people have to say. It's clear that it's a safe zone for everyone to speak and that we address the issues with an open mind. And if anyone who is in the group is not following these kind of basic rules of engagement, it's very important, I think, to have a zero tolerance policy and make it clear that you will enforce the safe space as well within the group. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's move on. And I'm going to start out by talking about a diversity survey that we did within the Plover Rovers, marine science communication charity that I founded. And we just surveyed our volunteers because we wanted to look at our internal diversity. 76.6% of our volunteers identify as female, around 20% identify as male, 4% as non-binary, and interestingly 15% live in a gender identity different from the one they were assigned at birth. 20% said that they belong to an audible or visible minority, or that they might be perceived as such by people who work with them. So we chose to go for the term audible or visible minority rather than looking at skin color or heritage, because it was about how you're being perceived. So you might feel completely English, but other English people might perceive you as somewhat foreign because of the way you look or the way you sound. So that's just the category that we went for. 65% of the volunteers identify as middle class and 32% as working class, and 27% have been diagnosed with a physical or mental illness or disability which affects their everyday life. So that's just a little peek into our own diversity, and I think it's nice to see that we cover some diversity. For example, that we have almost a third of people identifying as working class, because we're going to talk about class barriers in science. So I think that's definitely a good thing. Obviously, we do not have a problem with representation of females, which is great, and also very nice to see that we do have a fifth of people who have some kind of minority background maybe, and of course seeing the 15% with the living a different gender identity. That's also quite a high percentage looking at statistics of the whole population. And yes, over a quarter of volunteers who've been diagnosed with physical or mental illness or disability that affects them. So I do think that we cover quite a nice diverse group of people there. However, if we do look, for example, this is a picture now of all our great female volunteers. Overall, it does still look quite pale. So obviously, most of us are white. So there's still always something to work on when we're looking at internal diversity. And I think that's sort of the first step that we all have to take within organizations, that we just, first of all, just develop a baseline where we're at as an organization, how diverse are we, and where do we want to get to, and how can we do that. So the next thing is looking at current barriers in marine science. just some, I'm sure there's a plethora of barriers, but just looking at some of the current barriers that exist in marine science, there's direct exclusion, of course. There might be people belonging to certain sections of society who are just being told this is not for you. Either science is not for you, or in marine, if you're talking about conservation, the natural world is not for you. Don't bother. Basically, this is out of your depth. This is nothing that your people is dealing with. Then we're looking at educational barriers. That could be all types of educational barriers. It could be people who do not have the possibility to go to what's considered good schools, and maybe when they go to open days at universities, they feel like they're being discriminated against because of the postcode of their school district, which is something that people have told me about, which I find just beggars belief that happens. But so that's something, just being basically having gone to the wrong school, and that then maybe makes you have low academic self-esteem because you feel that you're just somehow not adequately prepared for a career in science. So that could be an educational barrier. Another barrier could be that it's very difficult for some people to convince their surroundings that they want to go on to college or uni, and not just leave education as soon as possible to get a real job, to try and earn money. So that might be a barrier that people around them don't support being in education for a long time because they feel it's a waste of time and money. It could be that you're growing up in a household where there are no books, where there's no academic support for you. So even if you yourself are interested, it might be very hard to actually achieve academically because you don't have the kind of support that other kids in your class might get. So all sorts of educational barriers. Now, of course, with COVID and access to online education, this domestic support is becoming even more important, and we're seeing it already that kids from a background where there is no academic support at home are falling behind. Then there's the lack of role models, and we will be talking about role models in more depth later on, where you just don't see others like you in the positions that you are aiming for. So if you don't see any lecturers or PhD students who are like you, that it just makes it harder to envision yourself on that pathway. If you have a lot of white middle-aged men in leading positions within the field of marine science, for example, and you are maybe a young Asian woman, it might just be harder for you to imagine yourself in that position, and therefore imagine yourself taking a pathway to this position. And of course also having the support of people, because other people see that there's no one like you in any kind of higher position that you're aiming for, so people might then not believe that you will ever make it there. Lack of role models. Cultural barriers. Again, might be all kinds of things. It could be that depending on where you come from, you just don't learn to swim. Especially if you're a girl, you may be not allowed to participate in swimming lessons at school, so you don't get to form this direct relationship with water at all. So that would be a cultural barrier. Or that certain careers are not considered something that people from your culture are doing. For example, that it's just a thing that if you come from a certain background and everyone in your community, if they do go on to uni, they will either study law or medicine or finances or engineering, for example, and that's the accepted pathways into higher education. But marine biology would be considered a waste of time. Or cultural concepts like marriage, that people would say, well, why should you go on to uni? Your main focus should be that you have to bear children, get married, have a family. It's just, again, it's a waste of time and effort basically to go into higher education, because in the end your aim is going to be to find a good husband and be a good mother. So all sorts of these kind of cultural barriers. And of course financial barriers, where we see in marine science and conservation there's a huge issue around unpaid internships, the demand for volunteering your time to a good cause, and this idea of this is a way to show just how dedicated you are. Now, if you are in a situation where there is no money in the background, where you don't have a family who supports you, where you maybe just have to spend all your free time away from uni, for example, working to pay the bills, then obviously your ability to volunteer your time is going to be very, very limited, or non-existent at all. So that's something that I've experienced, for example, coming from a poor background, academic but poor, that I had to work through uni. So I just did not have the possibility to volunteer besides my studies, because I had to do jobs that actually paid money. And of course, that is not as glamorous on your CV if you stacked shelves in a supermarket, rather than diving with turtles and doing turtle patrols on a beach somewhere in Costa Rica. And of course, you also don't get these kind of project management skills then from working in a supermarket. So that's a problem, that whole issue around unpaid volunteering and unpaid internships. But also things like, for example, diving. You're going to meet a lot of people also competing for jobs or whatever who have been diving for a long time. Obviously, diving is a very, very expensive hobby. It's going to just be impossible for a lot of people to do that. So that's not a financial barrier. And then we have the staggering number of that in the UK since 2016, only 245 out of almost 20,000 total PhD studentships were awarded to Black or Black mixed students. And there is certainly different reasons for this, but one of the reasons could be that they're very narrow selection criteria based on certain views of what excellence is. So if you've been through it, applying for a PhD, or if you ever looked at what they're asking for, it's always like, this position will suit an excellent candidate. But what is excellence? If excellence is defined by people having to have achieved certain things, and these people have not been able to achieve exactly these points of excellence because of certain barriers that are put in place that prevented them from achieving these points of excellence, then obviously they won't be selected. And that will make, again, the crowd of PhD students very homogeneous and all sort of able to reach these certain points of excellence that you can tick all the boxes and say, yeah, this is an excellent student, so he or she is suitable for this PhD position. So that's some of the barriers that we're looking at and that we're trying to address and tear down, hopefully, in the future. So what are the effects of these barriers? There's a million studies about that. And it's that there is a lack of cognitive diversity if you have very homogeneous groups. So basically, if within the marine science community, all of us are more or less streamlined because of the way that we've been picked by people who were already in the marine science community, then this will hamper our creativity and innovation, because we all will be trained to think more or less along the same pathways and within the same systems. Homogeneous teams are prone to developing groupthink, which is a very bad thing, because it's basically like shouting into your own echo chamber. It's like on social media, if all your friends feel the same way that you do, you're getting all of your opinions just echoed back to you. It's kind of like the same thing in a team like that. You're going to be more likely to just go around in circles and not be able to think outside of that box. Not saying that people in that team won't think creatively and outside the box, but it will be very hard to explore completely new avenues of thinking if there's no cognitive diversity. And this is reinforcing also in-group and out-group think, which is very harmful and which we will talk about later, and which will make it ever so much harder for new people to come into this group. Now, what is supposed to counter this kind of exclusiveness of certain sectors of society is this concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion. And when I was actually live running this seminar, I did a little poll on how confident we actually are around this concept of equity, diversity, and inclusion. The question was, how confident are you to be able to explain the concept to a friend or colleague? And it turned out that the confidence was kind of like oscillating between not confident at all and yeah, pretty confident. But no one was like, yes, absolutely, I can explain it to a T. So that's the first step, really, to get ourselves acquainted with the concept so that we can talk about it to friends and colleagues, and we actually have an idea of what the definition is of equity, diversity, and inclusion, because then we can talk about it and start having important conversations. So what doesn't make it any easier is that when you Google it, there's a million definitions, but this is just something I pulled from the University of Berkeley, which I just thought it was nicely visualized. So we've got diversity, which is all the ways in which people differ, and really all the ways. So diversity isn't just diversity in skin color or diversity in gender. It's all the ways in which people differ. We're all diverse in a way. Even if we're white middle class academics, we're still diverse in some way or the other. Equity is the fair treatment, access, opportunity, and advancement for all people, which means that one's identity cannot predict the outcome of anything, the outcome of education, the outcome of your academic career, the outcome of what job you're going to get. That's the idea of equity, that everyone has a level playing field, the idea of a level playing field. And then inclusion is a variety of people have power and a voice and decision-making authority. So inclusion doesn't just mean that a variety of people is somehow given access to a group, but inclusion really means that these people will also have a voice in that group, and they will have decision-making authority, and they will actually be actively participating in a group. And I want to focus in a little bit on the concept of equity, that central concept of the level playing field. And you've probably seen a variation of this illustration somewhere, where you have the idea that reality, obviously everything is very, very unequal, and some people have all the boxes and other people are down in the hole, and only some people can see the game and others will never see it. Equality is that we give everyone the same box, which helps even out things somewhat, but still doesn't really create a level playing field, because it doesn't take into account that some people might need more boxes than others. Equity is to actually look at achieving the same outcome for everyone, so that someone who doesn't need a box doesn't get one, someone who needs 2 boxes gets 2 boxes. And then the next step is liberation, which means we are removing the systemic barrier that creates the inequality in the first place. So we're removing the fence. And I think that it's really important to keep this last step in mind, because this is what we're aiming for. We're aiming to remove the barrier. We are not aiming to keep providing better boxes. And I think that's an important point, because we could waste time improving the boxes, but we should be looking at tearing down the barrier. So the boxes are important. The concept of equity is really important. We need to provide boxes for the time being, but we also need to focus on how can we actually remove the systemic barriers that make the playing field uneven in the first place, so that we can create that level playing field. The next point I want to talk about is conscious and unconscious bias. So basically, the thought processes that create all this thinking of in-groups and out-groups, and some people are like this, and some people are more suited to an academic career than others, and just what are the thought processes behind that. Now, first of all, everyone is biased. There's no person in the world who's not biased, because it's basically just our cultural makeup, our personal makeup, the experiences that we've made in our lives. It's going to form and shape our attitudes towards people, our attitudes towards how we see the world. We're not some kind of fantasy philosopher who's seeing everything without any kind of bias. That is not the problem. The problem is that we have to be aware of it. We have to be aware of our biases, and especially unconscious bias. Obviously, that's difficult, because unconscious means we're not aware of it. And that is something that we have to make visible, and through reflection, we have to try to address also the unconscious bias we have. And I want to talk about a really great project that maybe some of you are familiar with, which is the 56 Black Men project. I Am Not My Stereotype. This is an artist from London who created portraits of 56 black men, and that was the number of black men who had been murdered in London that year. I think it was 2018. And he basically has these black men in a hoodie, which is a very strong stereotype for many people. You maybe think this looks like a typical mugshot, someone who you wouldn't want to meet in a dark alley at night because you're afraid they might rob you or beat you up. Or so it's all these negative associations, a lot of them probably having to do with crime and gangs and things like that. And he interviewed every one of these men, and he told people what their actual occupations were. So if you look at what they do, one of them is a project manager in financial services, one's a court clerk here at the magistrates court, and a plumber, Battersea Power Station, very well respected jobs. And not at all what the stereotype of a black man in a hoodie would be with most people in our society. So this was just sort of pushing people towards realizing what stereotypes do I have within me, and how do they not correspond to reality? Because stereotypes do not correspond to reality, and it's important to realize that. It's a great project, and I encourage you to go onto their website and have a look at it. Now, a really interesting thing to kind of explore your own stereotypes and your own biases is the implicit associations test. It's a project by Harvard. It is a US-American project, so it's a little bit geared towards US-Americans, but still, it's you can still do it. You're participating in research when you do it, so that's nice. And you can test your own biases. It's really interesting. I did one which was preference between African Americans over European Americans, and my test came out that I have a strong automatic preference for African Americans. So obviously there must have been some bias. Probably I was influenced by the pictures of the Black Lives Matter movement and the attack on the Capitol with all the white Trump supporters, and I might now be biased against European Americans and more likely to think that African Americans are somehow more sympathetic or less dangerous. So it's really interesting. You can do it with gender, or you can do it with religions. So all sorts of different things where you can test your own biases. And obviously it's just one way of running a test. You don't necessarily have to agree with it, but it's an interesting experiment. To just start that work of reflecting upon your own biases. So yeah, what we need to do is we need to recognize our individual and collective narrative, and we have to challenge it. And we do this, one, by raising self-awareness, and two, by having conversations. It's important to have conversations because we need input from other people, and we need to sort of throw our own ideas at people and receive them back and start talking about things. When I was doing the live seminar, I had another quick poll here where I was asking how comfortable people actually are talking about these topics. Like if you have colleagues, for example, who belong to some kind of marginalized group, be it that they're disabled or people of color or belonging to the LGBT community, how comfortable would you be asking them about things? And if you do belong to one of these groups, how comfortable are you talking about it? And I think it's important to realize that people who belong to these groups might not always be in the mood to always talk about it, because sometimes it might feel like you're just expected to, at any trigger, to just talk about your situation and be happy that you can represent your group. That might not always be the case, might not always be the right time at that moment in your day that you want to talk about it. And also, of course, if you're the one who's asking, you might feel like you're intruding someone's personal space, or so it is a bit of a tricky topic, and it's definitely, again, it pays to reflect upon when is a good moment to talk about it, and how do I actually address these topics. Now I want to move along to the topic of role models that we touched on earlier. This is just a picture of a cover of a book, a children's book, that I took the other day because it intrigued me. Because I thought they're trying so hard, obviously, to provide a whole range of role models here, but they still kind of fail in a very central point, in the true sense of the word, in a central point. Because if you look at the Danger Gang here, I haven't read the book, so I don't know how it relates to the cover, but just thinking about the cover artwork, we've got a very diverse group of friends here. We've got the chubby little girl with the glasses. We've got an Asian girl there. We've got a black boy we've got a white boy, we've got a chubby kid, we've got a black girl, we've got like a skinny kid back there. So we're kind of covering a whole lot of groups and obviously trying to provide an identification person for a lot of kids. But who do we put in the center of attention? The flawless white boy. He's not chubby. He looks good. He's sort of the typical hero figure that we might also find in some 1950s Enid Blyton story. Why does the white boy have to be in the center of it all? And moving from children's books to the world of academia again, we were talking about the hiring biases for researchers or for PhD students, and this, as we said, results in a field that really lacks role models for minority groups. So the point is that if you do not see fellow researchers like yourself, it is discouraging. It can discourage people from entering the field at all, and also for those who are in the field and who maybe are making a career for themselves, it can lead to feelings of estrangement and a feeling of isolation, and that again can impact your sense of self, and also then of course ultimately your mental well-being, but also the quality of your work potentially. So there's a really interesting article by Cordelia Roberts in the October issue of the Marine Biologist, the magazine of the Marine Biological Association, which just shines some light on some of the problems around marginalized groups in marine science. What can we do in order to provide more role models for people? So obviously that is an important point. And talking about that whole idea of providing role models, I want to talk a little bit about visibility, because some markers for marginalized groups are clearly visible or audible, and then people belonging to these groups have no choice. Basically, they will be, if you're black, you will be perceived as black. That's very, if people see you, of course, now with remote working and all the different setups with working from home, it's actually an interesting point. Some of these situations could change, but still there will be certain clearly visible or audible markers that you can't get rid of. Then again, belonging to other collectives may be less obvious, and it may be up to the person belonging to them to come out basically and say, yes, I belong to this collective, or to decide not to do that and to remain anonymous, to remain invisible. And of course, if you do remain invisible, you will not be a role model for others like you, because no one will know that you are. So, for example, if you have an invisible disability, if you are in a non-heteronormative relationship, if you are living in a gender different from the one assigned to you at birth, these are all things that people will not notice, even though some people might believe that they would. I can assure you that they won't, unless you choose to say that, yes, I belong to that collective. This is where I wanted to talk a little bit about my own story as a diverse person. These are some pictures of myself, some there, me as a little kid, then as a youth with my band. There I'm around 19, and me today. And at first sight, it doesn't look very, very spectacular. You know, maybe a bit of an unusual pathway that I didn't sort of have the straight academic career, but I dropped out of school and spent some years being a professional rock musician in between before I then returned to academia. But there's more to it than meets the eye. I was actually assigned a female gender at birth, so I was born a girl. And obviously, as you can see, even as a child, I did not necessarily present as a girl. I was always, I presented more male, but it wasn't something that as a child I was concerned about, because my family was not a family that was sort of shoving gender stereotypes down my throat. So my parents were both very, it's a hippie generation, so there was no... being a girl or being a boy was not an issue. It became an issue then when I entered puberty and when it became very clear to me that I wanted to present as a boy, not as a girl, and I did. And that was in the early 90s, so there was not much awareness around the issue at all. I was certainly not very aware of the issue. I just knew what I wanted. I knew who I was, but I did not know the word for it. I did not know really how to address it other than just presenting as a boy and being very aggressive towards people who did not realize that or who thought that I was a girl. And also it led to me being very, for a while, definitely being very negative towards women, as far as that, because I disliked my own female body. I was very much buying into this misogynist world of I went into the subculture of being in a band. I was in a punk, hard rock, heavy metal band, and of course there's a lot of very sexist elements to that world, and I really bought into this, and I was trying to be basically like the most male dude of them all. This was a way for me to set myself apart from females. And on the other hand, of course, this whole rock world that I went into was very good for someone like me, because being sort of like really young and androgynous looking was actually a plus. It was something that was considered very cool, and people would think you're just a very cool guy if you looked really young and really androgynous. So that fit in very well with me just presenting as a rocking dude. So being in that subculture really helped. But of course, I would say I had a very difficult youth. I went through like eating disorder and drug abuse and everything, and that all had to do with struggling with finding my place and struggling to establish myself really in the role that I wanted to have. And then I managed to, when I was in my early 20s, I managed to get treatment and start transitioning properly, physically as well, until it just wasn't an issue anymore, because now outwardly I look like a normal man. And so when I actually went into academia and started working in academia, that all wasn't an issue at all. It was long behind me. It's nothing that in my everyday life has any kind of impact on me now. So it wasn't anything I ever considered coming out about. Even my closest friends wouldn't know that I was once born a girl. It's just not important in my life. I also never identified with the trans community. It was always something I very much shied away from. I didn't want to have anything to do with these people. I just wanted to be myself. I didn't want to be put into any kind of category that I didn't feel I belonged to. And I'm also in a same-sex relationship, whatever that means in my case. But I also never identified with the gay community, because that's not what it's about. It's just the person I love most. And it could be anyone. I don't generally find men more attractive than women or women more attractive than men. It's about the person. So I've never been to a pride parade or anything. It's just not a collective I identify with, even though I'm in a same-sex relationship. So I just don't like categories. And I think that then I started thinking about when I founded the Plover Rovers and I became director of this charity. I was thinking about, well, now how am I being perceived by people? I'm a white male academic who's very passionate about diversity. But and then I wondered, well, am I comfortable with everyone just thinking I'm this white male academic, really normal, sort of straightforward person? Now I'm like director of a charity, so I'm basically representing this successful white male European person who made it in academia. And then I realized that I wasn't actually very comfortable with that, because that's also not who I am. Obviously, my trajectory is different. And then I started thinking about the need for role models and the need for visibility and the need to kind of be out there for others who are at the beginning of their journey trying to get somewhere. So that's when I decided not long ago to write an article for the British Ecological Society and talk about my own personal story. So I had really great responses to that, and I'm very happy that I did it and that I put myself out there, and I hope that I can be a role model in some way. And if it's just saying you don't have to fit into a category, I think that's my main point. You don't, just because you technically belong to some collective like a trans or gay or whatever, like there is some kind of a pigeonhole for you that people will put you in. You can resist that. You don't have to do that. You can join a collective, or you can choose not to join a collective. You can just be yourself. You don't have to be your, if you're disabled, you don't have to be your disability. If you're gay, you don't have to just be gay, and that's like the main focus of your life now. It's just be you, and just encourage other people to be themselves as well. And like I said, we are all diverse. Everyone's diverse. None of us is exactly like someone else. So yeah, I think that's just what was important to me, and making myself more visible like that. And from that point, I want to talk shortly about in-groups and out-groups, because that is something that happens in very homogeneous settings. Like, for example, if you're in the marine science setting, and we're seeing there are very few role models for diverse people to come in there. So it leads to that we have a big feeling of there's a lot of people who sort of share the same trajectory, they share the same academic background, they share a lot of their cultural background maybe, and they form an in-group. And then we have other people, the bananas, who don't fit in, who just somehow feel that they're not part of that group that everyone else seems to belong to. And these people often, when people are in an out group, and they're being othered, they're being made to feel like they're the others, they will often try to change in order to be part of the in-group. So they will try to change the way they act, the way they talk, the way they address things, the way they will try to become part of that in-group, because it's not nice to be the other one. But the responsibility really for inclusion really lies with the in-group, because we can't just be sat there and build a brick wall around ourselves as the in-group and say, well, if the banana manages to scale that wall and come in, then we're going to be really welcoming. So no, we don't have a problem with people coming into our in-group. No, not at all. Once they get over that wall, fine. They can be with us. We're going to accept them. But that's not the way to attack it. Like, we have to tear down that wall. We are responsible for for creating a way into the group, for opening up the group. It's not the responsibility of the out group to make themselves fit the in group. It's the responsibility of the in group to make it possible for people to come in and to tear down these walls that we build around ourselves as the in group. So staying within our little academic in group, and we're looking at some of the processes that lead to these strong barriers between the in-group and the out-group. We're looking at stereotyping, and then we're looking at self-fulfilling prophecies. So stereotyping is something that we do all the time because it helps us to place ourselves within our world, and it helps us deal with things. So we categorize things. Humans love to categorize things. Like I said, I have problems with being categorized as something or the other, but of course we all categorize things all the time in order to just be able to navigate our lives. So we categorize a person. When we see a person, we categorize them. We say, so this is a black person, so he will have certain characteristics. Say if it's a black person with dreadlocks, he'll probably smoke weed and listen to reggae and be really laid back and enjoy doing things a little bit slower. Probably if you're working with them, they'll always be late handing in their assignments. So we just have just random stereotypes that we put together, and we attribute certain characteristics to people, and then we predict their behavior based on these assumptions we made, and then we ourselves adjust our behavior to behave accordingly to the predicted behavior of this person. And by doing that, we are, of course, then influencing the way that these people behave, because we are behaving according to our assumptions. So that might force them into certain behaviors, which will then confirm our judgment. And that way it's like, I was right all along. And this is just a vicious circle, basically, that just reinforces stereotypes all the time. So that's something we have to become aware of. And again, we have to reflect. We have to ask ourselves, am I just making assumptions here, because we should never make assumptions. I think that's just a big rule. Like, assumptions are tendentially something that we should always ask ourselves. Am I just making assumptions here, and why am I making them, and is it really useful that I'm making them right now, or am I just sort of going down this one thought path, and not allowing anything else to come into it anymore? Next thing I want to talk about are microactions and microaggressions. So often, I think, as academics and living within an academic setting, we're going to say, well, at least those minority groups with us, they don't get beat up, and there shouldn't be any kind of gross misconduct towards them because we're too educated for that. Like that's something, maybe in other walks of life, if you're openly gay, you're going to get beat up. But with us, that's you can be safe within an academic setting. So I think it's often what you kind of assume. I mean, obviously, it's nice not to get beaten up. But what really makes people feel othered and makes people feel like they're not being let into the in-group are things that can be described as microaggressions. And microaggressions are sort of the everyday little comments and snides, and maybe even something that's supposed to be just nice small talk, but that makes you feel like you are not part of us. You are part of the others. So there's just a couple of examples here on this slide. For example, if you speak with an accent, or if you have a foreign name, or if you have a skin color that differs a lot from people around you, you probably have heard before no, but where are you originally from? So someone might ask, where are you from? And you say, Peckham. And then someone says, yeah, but where are you originally from? And then say, well, I'm from Peckham. But where are your parents from? Well, they're from Peckham as well. Where are your grandparents from? You must have come from somewhere outside of the UK at some point, because I don't think that you're one of us. So basically, you're being probed until the person talking to you can put you somewhere outside. And this might just be intended as small talk, where you're from. It's one of the things you ask. And personally, coming from a background where I don't particularly identify with any kind of home country, and where I come from a sort of multicultural background, I'm always very bothered by this question, because I'm feeling like people want to categorize me. Like, they want me to say I'm from Germany, and then they're going to have all these things that they associate with Germans. And then they can put me there, and they can say like, oh, great, yeah, this is a German person. Or they want me to say I'm English, and then they would have the same for England, or they would want me to say whatever, I'm Catalan, and they would have it. Well, then maybe they wouldn't know what it is, depending on how educated they are on sort of internal Spanish affairs. But in any case, they're trying to put you in somewhere. And depending on your own personal makeup, this might be something that really bothers you, and that might feel like an aggression towards you in a way. Another one that probably everyone who's in a homosexual relationship maybe had gotten before is, so who's the man and who's the woman? And there you have to ask, like, well, what is this even supposed to mean? So, like, if I'm being asked this, I would ask back, what do you mean by that? And then it will probably turn out that the person means, well, the person who's the woman is obviously the one who's kind of like, doing the cooking and the washing and the household and, that sort of stuff. And then you can say, well, this says a lot about your picture of women in society now, doesn't it? Because obviously this should not be what a woman is supposed to do in our day and time. So again, they're trying to somehow put you into a category. They're trying to, in that case, put you into a heteronormative scheme that they just somehow need in order to feel comfortable. Or another one's like, oh, but you don't look gay. So what is that even supposed to mean? You don't look gay. So like, gays, what do gays look like? Is that supposed to be sort of like a nice thing to say to me? If you're saying like, oh, gays generally look really, really silly. You don't look silly, so I wouldn't have thought you're gay. So is that like a compliment or what? I don't understand. Like, so again, it's something that might be meant in a sort of friendly way, but it's really something that can be very hurtful or very bothersome to you. Of course, things like you throw like a girl, you have this whole idea of like girls can't do sports, whatever, or you don't even seem black. What is that supposed to mean? What are black people supposed to be like? So yeah, there's many of these little things, and I think probably most of us are guilty of having said something like that at some point in our lives, and not thought about it, and just thought like this is normal friendly small talk we're doing. But it definitely, I mean, it could also be how old are you, if someone somehow, like, age is also something where you're being put into certain categories. So in any case, these microaggressions have been described by someone once as being like 1,000 paper cuts. It's like, everyone knows a paper cut. It's not a big deal. You're not, you don't have to go to the hospital. You're not gonna. It's not life threatening, but it's painful. It's annoying. And then just imagine getting paper cuts just all the time. Full of paper cuts. That's really gonna hurt someone. So these little microaggressions or microactions, like saying to a young woman at a conference, "Oh, are you here to take the minutes?" When maybe she's actually chairing, or asking, where are the refreshments? Because obviously a young woman is probably, somewhere with the event management, or not in a scientific position. Like, these would be micro actions that would other these people. So it's something, again, we need a high level of reflection. We need to be able to ask ourselves, how do our actions and the things that we say affect other people around us? So how can we counteract bias? How can we counteract these pathways of thinking? How can we help in our organization, within our university, within the circles that we move in? What can we do to actually make it better? First of all, as I said early on, we need a zero tolerance policy. If anyone is acting in a sexist or racist or any kind of a non-respective way towards minorities, we have to address it, and we have to show these people that this is not being accepted. And I think this is often still not being enforced enough. Because even though many places do have a zero tolerance policy, they might still shy away from actually enforcing it if someone oversteps a line, because they maybe don't want to get that person in trouble, or they think, oh, but he doesn't mean that, or whatever. But I think it's really important to enforce it, so that to show people that you're taking it seriously. Open communication, talk about it. Have surroundings that make it clear that it's okay to talk, that everyone is in a safe space to communicate with one another. Visibility and role models, like we said. Try to provide people with role models, with people who are like them, people they can relate to. And this will also give them possibility to do networking, because that's another thing. If there's no one like you, it's harder maybe sometimes to network. So looking at there's great networks popping up all over the place. There's the British Ecological Society has an LGBT plus network, which is really good for scientists to get to know each other. There's Black women in marine science, Black women in shark science. I think there's one. There's of course the whole STEM network, which is about networking for girls and women. So that's really, really important. Then, as I kept saying, reflection and self-awareness is key. And in order to be able to do this, we need to provide a healthy workspace, because bias control is less effective when we are stressed, tired, under pressure, low on glucose also. And there's studies about that our brain just doesn't work the way it's supposed to work when we're stressed out, tired, or under pressure, which means as employers, we have to provide a healthy workspace and give people the possibility to have time to be self-aware and to reflect and to control their biases. And this only works if we don't stress them out. Make it clear that it is everyone's issue. It's not the issue of just the minority. It's like the Black Lives Matter movement saying it's not a black issue, it's a white issue. Racism is a white issue. It's not something that only the blacks have to take care of. It's often, I think, that way, that if you have an organization and there's one single person who's maybe, say, a person of color, and then that organization says, oh good, we're going to have a representative, like a minority representative kind of thing, we're going to create that role, and everyone would expect that person to have that role, because they're the minority, so obviously they should take over that role, and no matter if they expressed any interest in that or not. So I think that's a thinking mistake again. Like, it's everyone's issue. When we have a committee on diversity and inclusion, it doesn't make sense to only have diverse people, diverse people in there. As I said, we're all diverse. You know, you need the white middle-aged men in there as well, because it's everyone's issue. And lastly, pay attention to language. And that's something I want to say a word or two about the importance of language. Because traditionally, of course, the culturally dominant groups shape language and classifications. And language is what shapes our world. This is what makes us human. We talk. We have language. We use language to describe things. Basically, we are language. Anyone who underestimates the importance of language just hasn't understood how important it is. It's absolutely key to understanding our world is our language. And like I said, language classifications. So if only the dominant groups shape our language and our classifications, that means that marginalized groups will be excluded from that normality that our language builds around us. So, for example, if neurodiverse people, like people on the autism spectrum or with Asperger's, for example, they're still classified as disabled. So this insinuates that they're less able or unable to do things. But they're just different. So why are they disabled? Gay people were classified as criminals or as a disease not long ago. When I first started with my transition, it was classified as, I think, a psychological disease or like a condition, and I had to see certain doctors who had to basically write things about me saying, yes, this person has this condition, and I felt extremely uncomfortable about that and being sort of put into a position where all of a sudden I had some kind of psychological condition, so that was really, really strange. So this was all about how do we talk about these conditions? How do we classify things? So this is all about language. For example, when we did our diversity questionnaire within the Plover Rovers, one of the suggestions that came out of it was to, when we write an email to all people in the organization, to not write "Hi guys," but to write "Hi all" or "Hi everyone," because guys doesn't include the women technically, even though it's often used in the way that you say "Hi guys." But so that's something I always really take care of now. Or that we say, we use in our email signatures, we use our pronouns, that we write like which pronouns we use, just to normalize the fact that for some people it's important to let other people know what the correct pronoun is for them. So I just want to say that you will probably meet people who will find this whole discussion about language and wording somehow tedious, and might also think like, oh, this is just like these political correctness crazies, trying to like, what am I even supposed to say? Can I call these people black or people of color or what? And LGBTIA, I don't know, like what's that, and it's probably people are going to get grumpy because they feel like they're not up to it, or they feel they're somehow making a fool of themselves if they can't use it correctly, and that's why they'd rather not use it at all. But in any case, I think it's important to be aware of language, the importance of language, and to really, if these marginalized groups come up with take the power back and talk about themselves with the expressions that they themselves would like to use, then that is taking the power to actually shape the world that we live in. And I think that is a power that we all should be granted, and not only the dominant groups should be granted that power. So I think language, really, really important. It's not a minor consideration. It's not an afterthought. Language is absolutely central to everything that we do. And lastly, last slide, I want to talk about recognizing privilege and responsibility. So all of us are in some way probably privileged. Can be a privilege, for example, if we're in a straight relationship, we're privileged because we fit into the heteronormative world that surrounds us. We don't have to deal with explaining that, if you say like, oh, can I bring my partner? And then someone says, what's her name? And then you have to say, well, actually, it's a guy, and already it's somehow a topic. You don't have to do that all the time when you're straight. all the love songs on the radio somehow apply to you, and you can identify with them. Most movies somehow touch on your life reality as a straight person. So it's that's a privilege to be straight in a heteronormative world. It's a privilege to be European. I know, like, I'm sorry to my British viewers who are not European anymore now, but even being British still it's a privilege because we have a passport that lets us travel. We're going to get visas to visit other countries. It won't be a problem to work abroad. If you come from certain countries, your passport just opens the doors for you. And you come from other countries, you run into huge problems, even getting a visa to go somewhere, to work somewhere. If you're male, obviously, in a world that's still in a lot of ways patriarchic, that is a privilege. To be wealthy is a privilege, obviously. If you're independently wealthy, you can afford a lot of things, you can afford to do a lot of things, or to be freer about a lot of things that other people cannot be that free about if they need to worry about where the money for the next bills comes from. Middle class, if we're middle class, we have certain privileges that maybe people who belong to the working class wouldn't have. To be employed is a privilege, obviously. We know where the money is coming from. We have a possibility to work in our field. We have the possibility to have an impact in our field. To be academic is a privilege. To come from an academic background is a privilege because it makes it easy for us to work in academia because we're used to it. So recognizing all these privileges and not to be ashamed of them. I don't want to go privilege shaming at all. I don't think that's a good thing to do, because I know that if you're, say, a straight, white, European male, and you're working, say, in conservation or in charity-related work, you might actually get a lot of negative energy directed towards you. Say, if you go and work for a charity in Africa, you might be confronted with a lot of neo-colonialism ideas, and that you are like the white man on the steed riding in there to save all the poor uneducated Africans, and this might not at all be what you intend to do, but this is how you might be seen, and that the privilege that you have is almost being used against you as a weapon. So I don't think that that's a good thing either. I think it's no one's fault if they have a certain privilege, and it shouldn't keep people from being able to work in a field that they want to work in and that they're passionate about. But it's important to be aware of privilege, recognize it, and see the responsibility that comes with it, and try to use that privilege to basically reduce it. Like, use your privilege to reduce your privilege. I think that would be a good thing to do. That was all from me. Thank you very much for listening to this presentation. If you have any questions, you're very welcome to get in touch with me about anything I've said. I know that I can never cover all aspects of diversity in one presentation, but I hope that I just managed to give some impulses for thought and reflection and for conversations that can lead us further into removing the barriers that we still have in place, and coming to a more diverse community in marine science and generally in the world. Thank you very much. Here's some useful links, and I hope that you enjoy yourself. Goodbye.